Alors, bonjour à tous. Donc, on est au 4e jour de notre symposium sur la question de l'art, de la durabilité et de l'engagement. Comme je l'ai indiqué les jours précédents, c'est une année évidemment un peu particulière pour nous. C'est la 3e édition donc, de ce symposium organisé par Thanks for Nothing. Les années précédentes, donc en 2018 et en 2019, nous étions en partenariat avec l'École du Louvre, puis avec le Musée du Louvre. Et cette année, pour des raisons que je n'ai pas besoin d'expliquer, nous avons décidé de faire ce symposium en ligne et de surtout, comme on dit en anglais, join forces, donc de mutualiser nos collaborations avec des institutions internationales, en l'occurrence avec la Serpentine Galleries et Lucia Petroiusti, qui lève la tête justement et qui s'occupe du projet General Ecology à la Serpentine Galleries et avec le magazine Art Review. L'idée, c'était aussi pour nous cette année de nous dire que finalement, on ne peut pas se retrouver physiquement à l'auditorium du Louvre, mais que c'est aussi une bonne année pour intensifier ces collaborations internationales avec donc des artistes, des penseurs, des associations, des humanitaires de terrain qui agissent partout sur la planète. Donc depuis lundi, on a eu la chance d'avoir beaucoup de personnes qui ont participé à ce colloque. On en est ravis et aujourd'hui, je suis particulièrement heureuse puisque donc on a laissé une carte blanche à Lucia Petroiusti, à la Serpentine Galleries, qui aujourd'hui donc a décidé d'inviter Isabel Lewis, qui se trouve actuellement à Bâle, et Fernando Garcia Dori, qui est actuellement à Madrid. Et donc voilà, je trouve que la proposition de ce soir qui s'appelle About Place est à l'image de ce qu'on veut porter aussi cette année. Voilà, Lucia est en Grande-Bretagne et on se retrouve tous ensemble ici pour partager le projet de ces deux artistes. Lucia va les présenter plus en détail. On va en l'occurrence passer en anglais puisque la conférence se tient en anglais. Et c'est aussi l'occasion pour moi d'annoncer la programmation de demain, qui sera donc le dernier jour de ce colloque. Donc demain, on a donné une carte blanche au magazine Art Review, qui est notre partenaire, comme vous le savez. Et ils ont proposé donc une table ronde qu'on annonce là, qui s'appelle What Can Art Do? Et demain, nous allons recevoir donc Norberto Piwi Roldan, qui s'occupe du Green Papaya Art Project à Manille, aux Philippines, donc, du critique philippin qui s'appelle Marv Recinto et qui seront en discussion avec Phil Churchman, qui est le rédacteur en chef de Art Review en Asie. Donc demain, voilà, on se retrouvera carrément en direct de Manille avec un décalage horaire énorme, mais apparemment, les gens en sont ravis d'arriver en pleine nuit avec nous. Et donc demain, on sera littéralement tourné vers l'Asie. Voilà, et donc je vous remercie à tous parce qu'encore ce soir, vous êtes plus de 90 inscrits pour cette table ronde. Donc on est évidemment très heureux. Et now I'm going to switch to English and just to welcome our guest again in English then. So welcome Lucia. We had Lucia already on Monday in dialogue and conversation with Lina Lapelite. And of course, we're very happy to have you already on Monday. And today it's a carte blanche to you and to Serpentine Galleries that you prepared with your team as well. And of course, I'm very happy to meet and e-meeting Isabel Lewis here, who is now in Basel, as I said, and Fernando Garcia Dori, which is in Madrid. And now it's all yours. And again, thank you so much for joining us and joining Thanks for Nothing on this great symposium on art durability and commitment. And I'm sure, and I know that you are one of the most interesting thinkers and artists that we can have this week to share all the programs and projects that you have made in different institutions, but also with goats and mountains, I know, for you, Fernando. So thank you again for being with us, and it's all yours.
I did promise goats, I have to admit. Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. An enormous, first of all, thank you to you, Isabel, and you, Fernando, for being with us tonight. A huge second time that I get the chance to thanks for nothing. Thanks for something, thanks for a lot. You, of course, Marine, Clarisse, Blanche, Lara, everybody that we've been in touch with. It's been a joy to work with you so far, and I can't believe that this is the last for a little bit. Thank you also, enormous thanks to Holly Shuttleworth and Kostas Stasinopoulos, who are the other 2/3 of the 3-part team that is General Ecology. And to a great extent, this convening comes together as a result of that many years of joined to work. So for that, thank you to them who are, I'm sure, watching. Isabel Fernando Isabel, I have enormous admiration and am kind of humbled and inspired by both of your works. Fernando, we have been, in the context of general ecology, the project at the Serpentine, which concerns itself with embedding the environmental, the environment and environmental principles and concerns throughout the things that we talk about and the way that we talk about them. In the context of that, we started quite early on with a conversation, and it was quite clear that the entire ethos of the process with which you run your artistic practice and the practice of inland is a very good example of that thing that I was actually talking about last week, on Monday, of the fact that before, you know, curators and art institutions start to become involved and invested with the environments, artists are always looking, going there first. And so, you know, much to do with inland has been completely fundamental and inspirational. And we've been working for a long time on a project together called Microhabitable, which is a sub-part of general ecology, and we keep making sub-parts of sub-parts, and it all gets quite complicated. Isabel, we're actually quite new collaborators and interlocutors, even though I remember very well how powerful your intervention in the memory marathon back in 2012, yes, was. And of course, your practice is so, draws from so many different elements, from literary criticism, which I know forms part of your trajectory, through to, of course, dance, choreography, DJing, and then what you call occasions and gatherings and situations. Maybe you don't call them situations, I'll ask you that. Which really rethink, you know, of course, the sort of stage public thing, but also where the organism's boundaries really kind of begin and end. And so all this to say that, unlikely as it may seem as a assemblage, when we were thinking about what we could do today, and Isabel, you said that you were every day practicing and re-practicing your live exhibition at the Kunsthal in Zurich, and that's in fact, you are kind of there, even though just run off for a little bit to Basel. But, you know, thinking about you in that space, reworking the exhibition with obviously the other collaborators. And then the fact that most of the time that I send you a text, Fernando, you're in the mountains, and that inland is a project that is so committed to the place in which, out of which it emerges. It then occurred to me, well, if we wanted to kind of think a little bit about ecological practice, then maybe we could start by thinking about place. So that was the idea. I mean, it's not, it's a simple idea. So to begin, I wanted to ask you actually about the present. So maybe in fact, Isabel, given that your present is very present, the exhibition at the Kunsthal Zurich is called Scalable, Skeletal, Escalator. I practiced saying that. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And you've spoken about, well, actually, can you just tell us a little bit about it?
You have to unmute, Isabel, please.
Mute.
Okay, here.
I'm there. Okay, super. So Scalable, Skeletal, Escalator is an experimental live artwork that is happening currently at Kunsthalle Basel upon the invitation of Daniel Baumann, who's directing Kunsthalle Basel and who witnessed a work of situational theater, I would call it, in the Sharjah Biennial. That was quite a large-scale collaborative effort as well, and had many agents involved that played a role in the performance. And observed this kind of way of working like an individual artist, using the platform of a biennial invitation to create this kind of work that included many voices and nonetheless had a kind of whole sense to it. And he invited me with some of those collaborators to Kunsthalle Basel. And I have continued with the kind of the provocation of being invited as a kind of group. We are not a collective. We just happen to be in each other's lives. And we've collaborated on several projects together, but each of us with our own also individual lives and trajectories of career paths, and working in several different contexts, from science and research, smell with Sissel Tolas, to experimental and algorithmic composition, music and percussion from the duo Labor, a sonic entity based in Berlin. From painter, sculptor, wide range of practices, Dirk Bell, Matthew Lutzkenoy, as well a painter, with dancers, the field, that are based in Switzerland, and other Swiss-based performers, and Yolanda Zobel and Marcelo Alcaida, who have taken on the what we wear, what the performers and what we all wear inside of the show. So this invitation to sort of invite my way of working comes from Daniel Baumann, and due to like a series of you know, of course, with Corona, certain shows which were canceled, it ended up that I had access to quite a lot of the space. What initially was an invitation to inhabit one floor of the Kunsthalle. The Kunsthalle became available, multiple floors of the Kunsthalle, and I got interested in creating an exhibition that could sort of move on from my interests and research in evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis's ideas about collaboration and composition and cooperation and symbiotic relationships between species as actually a driving force of evolution. And I wanted to see if I could take these ideas and bring them into practice inside of an exhibition. So how could I make an exhibition that itself would be a kind of holobiont, a kind of multi-organismic assemblage, which very much like the human body itself, which the work is somehow about a history of this idea of the body, and how to reflect that as well in the way of working, and the way of working collaboratively and cooperatively, and creating this work that proposes these kind of different movements and circulations, like different circulatory systems, basically, inside the Kunsthalle.
Thank you so much. You actually sent quite a splendid offering video collage of what the environment of that exhibition is. So should we look at it now?
Sure.
Maybe? Okay. I'm going to share my screen again and share this. And then you're going to see the desktop. There we go. Tell me if you can hear the sound, maybe. Thank you so much, Isabel, for sharing that with us. And just kind of on a whim, is there anything that we could show? And in the midst of being there all day, I'm sure every day, you managed to send us this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So holding that place, and to a certain extent the body as a place, over here for a second, and then moving on to another place and holding them both kind of together and seeing what happens. Fernando, I think it's useful, even though the world asks you this a lot, to speak a little bit about inland as a concept, because it emerges from place, but then it goes and touches system, like art system, all kinds of, and all kinds of different fields, and then brings them back to place somehow. So maybe can you talk about that kind of rootedness of inland and how it therefore how it functions?
Well, thank you. So we were talking about place. Yes, inland as a place as well. No, it was great also to see, to have the chance to have a glimpse of Isabel's work, because I was wondering as well to see how things happen and are inhabited there in the art space as well. No, the things that you're working with, and the difficulty of translating as well, I guess. No, the everyday and your practice into these limits, no, that the art system somehow brings with it and for us. I grew up in between places. The fact of growing up between an abandoned village in the mountains and the city, and I always felt like this need of connecting places and rethinking how we navigate them, because of the urgency of the ecosystemic collapse, no, we are living through, and that I actually just discovered it when I was 18 years old through a book that was published in the 73, The Limits to Growth, no, by the Meadows. So we are like 50 years later now, kind of having breakfast with this news of melting of the ice ball, of the ice layer, as well as many other aspects of extinction and problems at biospheric level. And I think that was very early on influencing my practice. And I thought that it's not about just talking, no, about ecology, representing it in the art sphere, but rethinking ecologically our different environments and our different spaces, no, professions and faculties. What I mean is that I started to think on the ecology of the art system, and also rethinking the idea of Guattari, you know, of the different ecologies interwoven, no? The different levels of ecology, the biospheric, the personal, the inner, no, subjective. In this sense, inland started like 10 years after I started my practice on this field, and 10 years ago. So like a little in between decades of practice. And I think the idea was to create a art institution as a sort of a frame, a place in which another form of practice, another form of relation, another form of overcoming, no, the vulnerability as well of the cultural worker within the art system, no, and rethinking that idea of scarcity and turning it into abundance. It's very much related with the fear of scarcity we have while we live in the city, no, a place where it's a hostile, if you like, somehow, technosphere in which you actually can't, no, handle natural resources. You have just to transfer money that you earned by putting time, lifetime, no, into goods, and that kind of let's say dispossession of the resources. It's something that I think is crucial to put into question. So the idea was to try to create a platform in which land workers or land producers and cultural workers could meet, somehow create a hybridization between both, no? Because cultural manifestations of living in the land are crucial to reconnect with a place, I just sent you a picture, sorry, like always last minute, of a poster that I remember Hans Ulrich was asking me to send to an exhibition about like origins or something. And then when I sent that poster from the village, it was last year. At that point, I was always feeling this kind of anxiety we all lived in, in the sense of the fear of missing out, a strong drive, and careerism that drives art as well. Thousands of planes flying over us, hypermobility, distortion of attention, or let's say dispersion. And on the opposite, to try to claim, to stay in a place attentive, and cultivating bones and storing fruits. And the idea of storing fruits is to store togetherness and to store forms of being together, especially in times of growing polarity and growing appearance of very regressive and conservative ideologies and regimes. And it's sad because, yeah, we will react with fear when the things shake, and things will shake and are shaking. So how to just stay in a place attentive. So I remember I went to a little island in Greece once doing a project for Athens Biennale, and it was Skiros. In Skiros there is something that is happening. I think it has even a Dionysiac root in the ancient times. It's called the Goat Man of Skiros. I wonder if it's only for men, but let's say the goat people of Skiros. And it's a festivity, seasonal, where actually they wear like goat skins and a lot of bells. And I thought, okay, what a great fiesta, no? So this happens one day in the year, that you go dressed as a goat and make a lot of noise in the village. And they started to tell me, well, actually you don't dress yourself. Some other people have to dress you. So it's like a collective process of like making a goat people. Then it's not just a day. You start by actually growing the little kid of the goat that will give you the skin for the face, because they have like different patterns, like a kind of a Rorschach test pattern made by the pigment of the goat skin, that's the mask. And then you just go into the village at a certain point of the day when you feel, okay, I'm going to become goat person for a moment. So the strength of that operation with the sound and with the space, and I realized that, yeah, that the importance of the ritual in peasant cultures and how it was embedded in their everyday was a way to break the everyday and reconnect with the place in another level. And we have lost that. I remember that very beautiful quote. I think I sent you that picture of a quote, or maybe not. But yeah, the quote is by...
The poster you just shared?
No, I think something I just share with you. Maybe
yeah, you shared a poster. I just showed it, didn't I?
No, yeah, another quote. But
a different one. Okay, let me find it.
No, I think
I'll find it in the meantime.
Okay, so it was this director of a Romanian Museum of Peasantry, and very interestingly, he was just not, like how to say, claiming that there was like a golden age in the past, but actually that golden age, or at that moment, it's something to look at, to just realize how spiritually poor we are today. So that's also interesting. That today we kind of look back, and especially the art system till very recently was considering that the art system has its places, or better say non-places, the hot spots, the great places for making an art career, like New York, Paris, wherever. But then this dynamic between center and periphery, in terms of creation of culture and cultural values, interesting. Like, for example, take flamenco, that was an expression of the Roma community or Gypsy community, and excluded, let's say, subordinated, subject, who that created in the outskirts of villages where they were not allowed to enter their own particular forms of expression, their dances, the songs, and so on. And then that kind of emerged, and created like a, let's say, a strong attractor, critical mass to actually change and shift attention from the centers. So now you can go to Broadway probably and have a flamenco dance on stage. So how we play with that? How we play with the dynamic center periphery in terms of cultural creation, and how we actually manage to have and use culture to shift our forms of being in a place and a form of understanding, no, what is, for example, a good life, without just transforming it in a recreation that exists only in the place of art, you know, in the common place of art, let's say, to another, and bring it to another commons. I don't know, I don't want to keep talking forever, and I don't know if I responded.
No, but it's amazing because, hang on, let me start. Was that the quote, by the way?
Which part?
The one that I just...
That was it.
The one you were screening was a series of quotes, yes?
Okay, good, good. So it happens very quickly to go from talking about place to talking about ritual, I think. And it happened to me when I was preparing. And I think it happens in your work, both of you, a lot. And because of the fact of that you've raised it, Fernando, this idea of like the ritual, the gathering, rethinking the ritual. And I've heard you, Isabel, speak about some of these gatherings that you do, some of the ways in which your work articulates itself in terms of, I suppose, thinking new rituals for contemporary, not rural, but perhaps urban environments, in fact. And actually, it reminded me something, because one of the other reasons why this about place made me think of you, Isabel, is that when we had a conversation recently about a project that we are, I hope, very much on the way to collaborating on, you spoke a lot about your studio, like the space of your studio, almost like an artwork in itself. And I was wondering if you could talk about that again, also in relation to this ritual.
Yeah, super interesting and many kind of inspiring flashes in what you were speaking about, Fernando, and bringing in this word ritual, I think is fantastic. And I recognize that there's a way in which I start to call, let's say, the typical conventions of how we do art, how we produce and show art, and the protocols, institutional protocols or bureaucratic protocols, or governmental protocols. These are all kinds of rituals. This is sort of how I start to look at these things. And in that sense of when I create what I see as works that play with those, let's say, conventions, I don't actually reject the conventions of exhibition or of theater, but rather I play with them, and I try to kind of from within sort of like tweak them towards like a different kind of, let's say, a consciousness, or like a relation to the sense of one's own embodied being. I think that's primarily, I think my focus being that, you know, coming from a history of dance, and how that history of dance and long-term dedication to sort of working with the materiality of the body, what I move through the world with that as the lens through which I see the world, as a series of choreographies and compositions, and these choreographies can concretize and sort of like come together and form conventions, can form protocols, or we could call them rituals, which you know, opens up a certain kind of connotation. Also opens up a connotation which people, let's say, within a Western cosmology, secular Western cosmology, we can be afraid of or uncomfortable with. And so I think there's a way in which my interest is to sort of make and actually create rituals for urban dwellers, people like myself who've grown up and live in urban places, but that nonetheless try to open up an awareness to our messy embodied being inside of our urban context, which would wish to kind of divorce us from our own bodily experience. The urban life is constantly obsessed with containing the body and its leakages, and try to find from sort of within an urban reality practices which reconnect us to sense of place, site, land, all of these important elements of ritual, actually. But I kind of try to do that from within an urban situation. So my studio, Lucia, to address that specifically, this is a kind of, you know, it starts as an idea in 2016, thinking about, you know, if, you know, at the time I was being asked to do a solo exhibition in Shanghai, which never actually came to be at MCAM, but in my response to how someone who does these kind of live, usually, you know, there's a durational aspect to them, but they certainly normally don't typically fulfill the exhibition duration. My response to that was to think about the question was sort of, how would I use an institutional framework if I were to sort of have that framework for myself. And I imagined something called the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices. And so this was something that came into being, or that I articulated in 2016, and then since then have been kind of practicing it here and there. Every new exhibition invitation gives me a chance to sort of practice what that could be, this sort of a potential for a kind of an institution that would gather itself around notions of practice and bodily engagement and relation, like body's relation and human relation to ecology, and sort of different ways of, let's say, focusing on the creation and production of intense, aesthetically engaged experiences, and sort of having also tools to be able to not only compose them or practice composing them, but also develop a language and a way to critically think about and speak about such experiences. So that sort of fiction has also now continued in my studio in Callies, Berlin. It's a new experimental art institution, and I have sort of a long-term residency there, so that the space of my studio starts to actually now become the site for unfolding the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices with different kinds of open hosted activities. So whether there's cooking broths with the artist Dirk Bell, cooking soup and inviting a few people to discuss a topic or around a particular focus, to workshops, practices of different kind of sharing, different techniques of embodiment that were happening, monthly sessions all through last year. Looking at different rituals, also like tea ceremony with one collaborator of mine from Seoul, Korea, Dambi Kim, who's a specialist in both Chinese and Japanese tea ceremony and makes her own contemporary understanding of a tea ceremony. She calls herself a tea artist. So using the studio as this active place of unfolding these kinds of embodied experiences that address, let's say, the entire human sensorium, and then talking about what that means to us and how that changes or affects the ways that we move through our urban landscapes.
And do you find that this is actually a question both about the exhibition in Zurich and about the Institute for Embodied Creative Practice. What are the emergences that happen that you set up maybe the parameters? Well, no, that you just don't anticipate.
Yeah, interesting. I think that there's a lot that goes into sort of setting up the conditions for then something that will take on its own life. So this is again part of this livingness that I try to sort of infuse into the kinds of situations that I work with, both in my studio and also in an exhibition context. That livingness, or there are things, there's kind of a laying of a groundwork which allows for this like livingness to emerge, which means that maybe but it does need structure, is what I've learned, like over many years of experimenting, that one thing is, yes, of course, something happens when you kind of invite people into a space and kind of, it can go in any direction, sure, but there's for me a sense of responsibility or accountability if you're the one doing the inviting, if you're the one arranging those situational parameters. And that's something that I take on very seriously, because I think there's a lot of ethical dimensions here that are important when we consider inviting people into something, and the contract of what it means to be a guest or a visitor or an audience member. So in the way that I've been, let's say, putting language and conceptually framing how I work in public situations, I tend to think of myself as the host, and that it's my guests that are attending the situation. And there's something about holding on to that rather than thinking of myself as the performer or the artist that's somehow separate from the lived conditions of the public or the audience, that we're bound inside of we're both responsive and effective to one another in both directions. So I guess I've spent a lot of the last 10 years of, in terms of thinking about choreographies which allow for receptivity and response. So how do you create a structure which nonetheless provides a framework, but is both flexible enough to be reactive and responsive to live conditions and emergent conditions, things that when you open to a public, that you cannot account for or know in advance, but also has enough to be able to also resist, like the rules, that somehow the rules of play in any situation have to be, let's say that the guest's agency needs to be apparent to them. And so there are many different ways of also like addressing that in terms of how the invitation is formed, how the duration works, so that it's clear that like coming and going is possible. Even little details, like making sure that an exit is always in view of like from the visitor's perspective, so that this sense of there is no, what we tend to experience in performance is sometimes a sense of transgression if we leave, or if we leave the space or disrupt or interrupt. So I try to definitely create conditions when I'm hosting that allow for the agency, or that account for that and allow for it. And not only that, actually use that agency as a generator of, it can actually initiate compositional sequences, as in the current exhibition that you're seeing these little windows of in Kunsthalle Zurich. There's a kind of game structure that the dancers employ, with a series of scores that they have to sort of choose from. And these scores are different kinds of bodily and vocal practices. And their way of unfolding the sequence of events has everything to do with the visitors' entrances, exits, levels of engagement, degrees of engagement, how long they stay in the space. So there's not a fixed script, while there is a sort of a shared content and material. But let's say that the visitor or the guest is very aware that somehow their presence matters. It affects what we do and how we do within the performance. So I suppose like there's so much. Like the question was sort of like what leaks out, or what emerges. And I think it's fascinating to me to see the ways that the kinds of, what emerges are creative, sort of generative moments that I could not have prescripted, that I could not have, it goes beyond, let's say, the situations that emerge both with the performers and the visitors, always goes way, way beyond like what I could have imagined. So it seems to really exceed, let's say, the individual imagination, and sort of takes up something of a what that magic of what a collective quality of ritual has.
Which I suppose is to a certain extent what the presentation of that work means by a holobiont. So the whole thing becomes this kind of multi-headed organism. I'm starting to see why instinctively it made sense to have this conversation altogether, by the way, because to a certain extent, there's this question of the para-institutional as well in both of your practices. And also this question of participating, of the audience, the place, the host, and the thing that happens, the ritual, kind of participating within one another's, I guess, role. I'm not sure. Fernando, who is the guest and the host in London? I mean, there's these sites, right? You have 3 sites.
Yeah, sorry, maybe it was.
I should say, like, works in, operates, is committed to 3 sites.
Maybe I was not very explanatory about that at the beginning, but yes, basically the idea of Finland, it's not so different from what Isabel was somehow also telling about the Institute of Embodied Practice and then the work within other commissions or whatever. And I think that's also how we work, the idea of a 2-tier, if you like, form of cultural production and the spaces that we kind of root, and they are in the mountains north of Spain and in Madrid and in Mallorca. And there we are like exploring the idea of communities of practice within what happens there, like somehow stays there. But there are, of course, protocols of hosting and something to relate not only to the visitor to the spaces, but also to the other community surrounding these spaces, and the idea of not just being bubbles of certain practice, but actually merging with the ideas, for example, of communal work and so on. Actually, I think I have a lot to learn from you regarding the idea of the embodiment of expression and the embodiment of so many also sensorial and haptic possibilities and potentials of development of the person, in the sense that I come from visual arts and more like drawing and sculpture, so I'm not particularly, like, say, agile in terms of bodily expressions, but I would say that we have been trying, and my relation to that has been through this, for example, idea of communal work, like making, like walking through the mountains with the flock in the shepherd school. That is a project of Finland. We train young people to be able to relate with the space and through the animals, because when you are like, the question of pastoralism is particular as well, because it's like extensive form of using the environment. It's not like growing, that involves like a piece of land you kind of cultivate and you actually fence very often and protect. But before, yeah, this is from today morning, and this is a student from the Shepherd School who is now in charge of the micro flock that we brought to the park. We are going to start to work with people with special diverse functionalities. I don't know how you say in English, like people with the different conditions, and in relation to the use, yeah, to the inhabiting of the space, of the land. So
maybe sharing the sound as well.
I don't know if I have sound, but we were not hearing it. So, for example, the voice. We often get students coming to the shepherd school, and they feel like not shouting to the animals or not talking to them. So you have to learn how to project your voice. So they follow you, and you become like more of a merge. And then Nel Cañedo, who is a member of Finland, who was a former student, he does the real difficult pastoralism in high mountain, and he was saying that you actually don't hurt the goats hurt you. So they take you somewhere. You need to just somehow balance the need to have their milk or something at some point, and their desires to be anywhere, actually very difficult places. And also we learned another thing in Finland regarding embodied practice. We were trying to plan beforehand, so the idea of collective agency is very difficult. I was just spending now 3 hours in a Zoom with the interlocal discussion for Documenta with one group of friends and groups from all around the world, and this idea of translocality and interlocality is also interesting. And we were trying to plan ahead and say, okay, what will happen next year, how we organize economy, because for us, that's very important as well, no? The infrastructure that sustains inland as well. I don't know if you have the image of the diagram. So in terms of planning, Nell was saying, well, wait a second, why try to plan like 1 year ahead? What I've learned walking and running after the goats is that you cannot really think. You have to just leave your body to put the foot in the next rock available without thinking, because if you start to think, where are you going to put your foot? You will never make it, you know? So it's like a way of being able to find the way forward while doing with the different conditionings in terms of space, in terms of speed, in terms of your weight, the relief and the steppiness of the mountain hill. And I think that's something very interesting to explore. We work with a choreographer who's coming from body weather practice. As you know, that's Min Tanaka school, no, of applying Butoh to the work on a rice farm. No? So he just left Butoh dance space to work in a farm, and then the movements of that, let's say, operations, no, they really influence the body expression. And yeah, that's something we are trying, while trying all those little things you can see in the diagram. That is the production of knowledge, training systems coming from the production of knowledge, and then the production in our spaces, and the production of a farm craft and art produce that is later traded to create an economy to access the land. So now we are like, working also in Europe with the idea of a confederacy of villages, no? A network of spaces in different countries, in England with Grace del Arts, in Italy and Castiglione, who has a very interesting work as well with the migrant workers in the south of Italy, in France as well, and Armenia actually in the Caucasus. So yeah, I think that this kind of social sculpture, if you like, it's becoming a little bit of a holobiont and the organism in itself, and we just have to follow its growth, and it's finally creating the environment in which we would like to be and to live. I think that's also important. That maybe you, Lucia, come from another generation. Your mom was discovering art povera in studios somewhere where an artist would be in his frog, maybe, no, doing things. But these days, no, where is the studio? No, what is this space of experimentation? For me, it's like in the village. It's in the space in the city where we're working with the neighborhood and trying to break this divide between city countryside, between culture and nature. And yeah, this expanded notion of what the art can do in the world is something I guess you are also exploring in Thanks for Nothing. And I think we need more of that. And yeah, and recover some form of agency, because I think, especially these days of confinement, we feel very much like powerless. But I would talk about this confinement as a blessing somehow as well. I mean, of course, it's hard and terrible, the fact of going through a pandemic at global level. But on the other hand, we have, let's say, a kind advice of what means the collapse of the different forms of balance at ecosystemic level. The jump from species, as epidemiologists are tracing, between wild fauna, which habitats have been disrupted, into domestic industrial farming systems, and from there to human that are like hypermobile through hypersonic flights. I mean, all that is just showing us a little bit of, well, let's try to take care a little bit more of the mess we are doing before it just explodes in our faces. That's a little bit. Sorry, I went back to ecology. We're talking about.
Well, why not? This is in the context of and actually, let's get right to that actually. So I have a slightly hovering and kind of badly, it hasn't crystallized, right? It's still, it hasn't turned into like cheese. Which has to do
melting
with
cheese. No, the Swiss form of eating it. Disgusting. No, it's fine. I mean, I'm with a French here. We can make a front.
Which has to do with ecological practice, or like ecological practice in the arts contexts now. not like land art, or as you say, like the other generations, or like this very masculine kind of land art action history. But ecological practice as it is happening now, not as we want it to be, like not as we say it is, but it isn't, like things that are actually emerging. And it seems to me that there's something that isn't quite the same as like social practice, or even maybe social sculpture, even though that is a really like, it's probably the easiest way of talking about it, right? But that is simultaneously committed to like what is aesthetic and poetic and performative perhaps, and to something that is systemic and infrastructural and so on. And in some way, like even though one wouldn't immediately see, you know, you wouldn't immediately, Isabel, perhaps you'd walk into the Tate piece and the abundance of plants and lusciousness of that environment would make you more prone to think that that is inspired by a series of I suppose, commitments and conversations that have a lot to do with the environment. Probably the Zurich piece, one would less tend to think that at the very outset, right? And so you kind of do that, or you see the diagram, Fernando, that you shared, and you sort of go, this is like systems, pure systems. And yet between the two, and yet there's like and not only, in the words of Marisol de la Cadena, there is a not only to that practice that leads you to hold those two things somehow together. And I was wondering, and yes, and absolutely, as you suggest in the chat of Zoom that the audience can't see, that there is something about the aesthetics of the infrastructure that I think is incredibly important in your in inland, certainly, but to a certain extent also in the seeing of a practice as an institute in your work, Isabel, as well. So this is, I guess, a question for both of you, but beginning from Isabel, and I'm going to take it in one direction, but feel free to take it to like just go no at that, which is something that emerged very strongly in our last conversation, had to do with deploying or practicing performativity, gatherings, sociability, place, to return to the sensorium, away from a visual only concept of the world, says the box on Skype, on Zoom, to lots of boxes on Zoom, but never mind, never mind that. So Isabel, yes, so yeah. Yes, all of that.
Yeah, question. Super, yes, with you. And for me, I think there's something about, a lot of times when we maybe talk about embodiment, it's not as though, I guess my interest is, it's not as though it's embodiment only for the sake of being in touch with the body and the pleasures that brings along with it, although I think that pleasure is a super powerful and effective kind of educational tool in many ways, like of her self-education. But I think that there's something about, for me, that the idea of attunement, practices of attunement to our actual lived urban conditions might, you know, cultivate, to use Donna Haraway's phrase, as cultivating the capacity to respond. So, you know, if we're kind of not attuned, if we're not kind of in touch, if we're numbed from our full human sensorium and overly dependent on the eyes, maybe we miss out on that potential for attunement, which is a kind of a hyper attention to your conditions. And without that, without cultivating that kind of hyper attention, can we make any of the necessary changes that we would need to make to have more ecologically lived lives and more ecologically formed institutions and governments? And on every level, I think, like, we have to, for me, it's Western cosmology that needs to be radically reconsidered. And in my inquiry, that starts at the level of the body, how we're educated about the body, how we experience our own embodied lives, and how the institutions which frame us, the architectures, the governments, the communities which frame our embodied lives, like how those are formed with an inherent fear, I think, of actually the body and bodily experience and difference amongst bodies, for example. And I think that, so in my case, you know, if you look at the Kunsthalle Zurich exhibition, there's a kind of artificial nature at play there. You know, there's a kind of inquiry also about these materials which are in space, and these plastics which feature for the first time ever in my work in Kunsthalle. You have these moving screens, these vinyl screens, which are modified welding screens. You know, there's this kind of a hard look at, you know, what are we, what constitutes our urban human lives, and how are we going to like reckon with these also materials that are not, that are already like inside of us, that constitute part of our materiality, and how can we maybe engage in a practice of hyper attunement to that. So in the case of my collaborator Dirk Bell on the project, he hosts what I call the compost, what we call the compost of the exhibition in the basement, where, you know, we've collected since the summer plastic packaging and all of these kind of materials, and there's a practice of working this plastic, painting it with like adornments with the fingers, and just kind of committing, like he and I have just somehow committed to these materials which we've now accumulated, and let's see, I mean, these materials will outlast our lives, but we're sort of committing to continue to work with exactly these materials and these screens and these objects which are inside of this exhibition. Is beyond the life of this exhibition. We're engaged with them as part of like a longer term process. And one of the characters in the show is this wax moth, which is which features in the paintings of Matthew Lutskenoy on the third floor. In the video, there was a kind of red painting, red and silver, that features this wax moth, which is a moth which decomposes, which has a bacteria in its gut, which decomposes plastic. So in the compost, the hope is to also introduce this wax moth to these materials and also allow them to collaborate and participate in the beginning, of course, of a process which will be very long and likely outlive us, the decomposition of these materials. So there's, I guess there's in the Kunsthalle Zurich exhibition this idea of site, place, Zurich itself, the Kunsthalle itself, an exhibition itself as a place, a body as a place, the architecture of the Löwenbräu building. All of these things are taken into deep consideration in terms of we engage with our daily activations of the spaces and we literally kind of remake the exhibition every day with all of its moving and scalable parts and elements. And for me, while there's no, the first work, maybe where there's no actual, one could say there's no like obvious signs of nature aside from like our human nature. It's entirely a kind of a way of trying to think about those kinds of like attunements into an urban environment. You have materials here like these old leather sofas, which are borrowed from the Schauspielhaus in the basement, where they've got a lot of old set pieces. And so these elements that are kind of unwanted and would otherwise be thrown away become these characters also inside of this exhibition, and a kind of the nature we've created somehow with our human efforts, and sort of a reckoning of how do we maybe learn, like we have it here, it's going to outlive us, how can we learn to have a different kind of relation to it rather than just throw the shit away, but like actually, okay, I'm going to invest in this commitment that I'm making by working with or let's say using these materials that also kind of constitute my own human form.
Yeah, and also that as humans, we're not humans. We're humans made of plastic, in part.
Yeah, absolutely.
The plastic that we make and that then we consume and that traverses us, and humans made of pharmaceuticals and humans made of plants.
Exactly, yeah.
And then plants made of humans, made of plastic, made of plants. It's
yeah, there's a hope of a kind of evoking that what is it that we call our humanity then, and what might it be if we attend to our material relations differently, and that kind of scaling out, you know, all the way like into sort of the attending to the microplastics that form us, the microorganisms that are dealing with those environments inside of us, and outward to the frame of the exhibition itself, and beyond, like asking those questions of scale, of jumping to sort of like different scales from the micro to the macro, and trying to propose, let's say, to not only to sort of deconstruct and criticize the Western cosmology and protocols of institutions, but actually to try to literally enact and perform another way, to propose alternative ways, and actually to try to practice them and see what emerges out of that.
Fernando, scale also an very important determinant of the shape of your practice, no?
Of our practice.
Of microhabitat.
Yes, we were talking a lot about that when we started to shape that specific, let's say, learning device, no, of common learning, in which, yeah, we were looking at a scale. And I think that, yeah, I need to read the book again that we were writing and the intro to remember some of the central ideas, but I liked a lot how we were exploring a scale, not only in the sense of yeah, of the physicality of it, but also like the spaces of intimacy, no, and relation as well, and also the we were talking about the infinite amounts, no, that we couldn't measure, and that notions, no, that also Duchamp was working with, of the, yeah, of something that you could not even grasp, but actually it is comprehending all the other, no? And it's also coming from, I think, in these moments of within dark matter in astrophysics, no? So it's like beyond the scale. But yes, I think that there was this book also in the beginning of ecologism, as well, Small is Beautiful, no, by Schumacher. And I think at least the notion of understanding there are certain scales that don't allow, that make not only a quantitative change, but also a qualitative change are crucial. For example, when we look at how beehives, you know, reproduce themselves, they reach a certain scale, and beyond that, they start a new colony, and it's not like growing forever. No, I think that only cancerous cells and maybe the human species can grow to forever. And yes, and I think that there's a sort of moment of refrain that I'm thinking a lot about these days. No, it's like how we refrain ourselves from what we desire and what we want, without ending up in moralistic also repressions. I mean, of course, we cannot just make like a parallel, no, between the repression in other realms of embodied sensorium experiences. But let's say that, yeah, technology, for example, no, allow us to do many things. And now there's a debate about how far we bring artificial intelligence, for example, and how far we let the algorithms and the interconnected forms of feedback loops and so on of machine learning into something. No? How far they could be restrained on that. No? So maybe that's the right word. And that also could apply to artists and to curators. How we say no sometimes, how we exert restraint, no? When we are sometimes also over-extracting, no? And over-exhausted our resources. But,
well, thank you for saying yes to this, though.
Sorry?
Thank you for saying yes to this,
No,
though.
you know, I'll never say no to you, Lucia. No, it was such a great idea to have the chance to know you all. But I mean, in general, no, I'm talking about the idea of limits in the everyday or everyday. Yeah.
I completely forgot to mention to whoever's watching to please do send questions through in the chat. But before we hand it over, and I was like, oh, we'll finish at 7, we'll have plenty of time. No. Just a word on this ecological practice and aesthetics of infrastructure, Fernando, from you, because I feel like I derailed you by asking you the question of scale. It went into microhabitable, but actually, like the question of like what that commitment to that kind of aesthetics is for you. Oh, I don't know if that's the question, but
the commitment to
the subject.
Yes. No, yeah. I mean, well, I don't know if I would call it just. I mean, it for sure has to exist within a certain form of form and aesthetics, but also considering aesthetics in the way Schiller would understand it, no, as a form of also learning and practicing and changing the person, no, through the interaction with the material, no. The material is also a knowledge. So I think the challenge is how this process-based, long-term, durational, engaged, and locally based projects, you like, or holobionts, can really have a second existence or a further existence or a composted byproduct, no, in another sphere. And I think that's also the challenge we have as artists. And I don't know, we experiment in Inland with that, from trying to use strategies of mirroring and camouflage and avoid, you know, like expressing the spaces of exchange we are developing in our communities of practice. And I remember was having a show at Casco, and the curator was saying, okay, that's great to show Inland, and let's have pictures of the gatherings in the village and so on. It's like, well, I'm going to bring like landscape drawings in pencil on paper. And it's like, all right, so exciting. But well, yeah, that's the point. I mean, like in this case, we wanted to camouflage, and that's also something, a conversation we're following for years with Hito Steyer, is like how there's ways of avoiding, no, and being like somehow, yes, avoiding the being in the frame, no, becoming yeah, an aesthetic representation. I think that's an important challenge. So that's why in the Inland website, at a simple level like that, we try to avoid pictures and we just hide behind those very, let's say, simplifying forms of representing the world that are the system diagrams. You know? And systemic diagrams were how the early ecologists were understanding a much deeper and vibrant and chaotic form of relation of organisms in a puddle in the road or at the biospheric level. So by understanding flows of exchange between matter, energy, and so on. But yeah, but at some point we have to communicate. So it's like which tools we use to communicate that are really dragging, no, the other to our space. It's like a dance, I guess. But yeah.
Can I play us out before the questions with some sounds of the messy? You know, we're with Filippa, who's just next room over. We are working on 2 future events, and one of them does have to do with polyphony as a way of getting a sense of the complexity of ecology. So maybe this is a good,
Please.
I don't know, maybe this is a good thing to share. Nearly with you. That.
Rebaño por el clima. Bitácora de viaje por la Cañada Real Segoviana. De Puebla de la Sierra a Casa de Campo. Jornada primera.
Está en buen camino. Yo creo que a ver si tienen los vecinos que nos dicen si subimos aquí o
I
no.
think it goes for 20 minutes.
It was just 1 minute. Finish this up. It's 4 minutes. But
Okay.
thank you so much. But Marine, do we have any questions? We do.
Let me just add about that soundtrack. That is just a program of the radio, and I think that's why the beginning, for example, has the like that other composition. So we're exploring sound and soundscape, but also developing sound podcasts or like radio podcasts as a form of, if you like, even propaganda, no communication, like in present context, for example, in Colombia or in Ecuador, no, the radio broadcasts were an important form of transmitting, no, and connecting and passing knowledge. And I think that we are exploring our radio station in Inland with those 3 levels, no, like experimental sound creations, like also the history of the use of broadcasting, no, as well in social political processes. And then in this case, we were just walking with the flock from the mountains to the COP25, the Climate Change Convention in Madrid, and bringing the flock there to also tell about like how mobile pastoralism is a solution, not a problem, no? In relation to simple UN assertions of a livestock system and animal husbandry as like being as a polluter as a car almost, no? And without making a difference between which system of production. And then from the city, sometimes making an assumption and saying, well, actually, eating meat is bad, but how would you tell an indigenous person in the Arctic, no, that eating a reindeer is bad? Should he go or she go to the bio shop to buy bio tofu? I mean, we need to also be aware of the conditions in which different communities in the world are living. Sorry, just my part of propaganda.
No, that's really, it's important to contextualize. Okay, let's do questions.
Back.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. No, I just wanted to thank you again. Thank you so much, Lucia and Isabel and Fernando, for this brilliant presentation, because I just wanted to add also that it really gave a continuum to all the guests that we had since Monday, because with Leila Slimani, for instance, we talk about the intimacy of creative practices, but we also talked about Western cosmology yesterday when we were receiving and hosting and welcoming Alec Cecchetti, that you know very well, Lucia, and actually we met through him also. And also we talked about Duchamp and the bees, because yesterday we had the chance to have Olivier Darnay, who is the founder of a wonderful NGOs working here in France, in Saint-Denis, with actually colonizing cities in France with bees, but not only bees, but also performance, because he starts with the dances and the movements and the body of a bee, and then of course develop it throughout a large scale performance into public space. And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, because I thought we had in this conversation like all the concepts that we developed since Monday. So thank you so much. And yes, so we have questions from the audience, and this is when it's like hosting a show. I'm moving the camera to Lara Ajar, who works with us, and she's been dialoguing with our audience, and she will share the questions for you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations. So I do have a few questions from the audience. The first one was actually for Fernando, but I believe that both of you could give us interesting answers about that. Both of you make very strong statements. We could say that you have quite a political stance in terms of the fact that we need to make a change in the connections that we make. And the question is, would you say that your art practice is a form of activism?
Okay, who's going to take that one out first? I mean, I think I'm in a moment. I think I am particularly in a moment. I also have to say I do hold an American passport. You know, my father is American, my mother is Dominican. Like, I think I don't know what the fuck, excuse my language, politics is anymore. I don't know what. I don't think I know or understand. Even like I feel like we could have another several hour long discussion about how we would begin to speak about what is activism. So I am not going to lay a claim on that space. I think I'm an artist, I'm a choreographer, but I feel urgently that yes, aesthetics is political. Forms of organizing is political. And maybe that's in short what I'll say for now.
If I have to respond to, it's how to say, it's difficult because I started by engaging in social movements. I'm still engaging in social movements like the nomadic people's movement and others. But after the moments, for example, of the Seattle revolts and the early wave of anti-globalization, I realized that it was kind of a little bit of a dead end, not to consider oneself activist. And I very much wouldn't associate myself with the term, in the sense that the activist is usually always active and doing doing something against others, in the sense that is possessing some truth. And well, in that specific moment, there was like in the autonomous movement, a pamphlet. It was about abandoned activism, and it was a very beautiful text resuming that how embedded practice and other forms of making that are not just, you know, they somehow even let's say performative aesthetical form of ephemeral protesting is not really, you know, to really bring radical change. So the need also of finding bridges and other forms. And that's what I learned also from the old anarchists of the 30s movement in Spain. They were not just going with black flags or something. They were just living in villages and helping some other neighbor to take their daughter to the doctor and so on. And then when fascists make a coup, they were just able to gather all the village and stand up. So that's the question maybe for me.
Thank you very much for your answers. We have a second question for you. Isabel, your performance or ephemeral many times, and it relies on volatile elements like smell. And Fernando, you too, you work in a place, we've talked about embedded practice, about situated practice. So the question is about documenting. Do you both think it's important to keep a trace, to document these moments, or does the memory has to fade away?
You're going to say that also I work with cheese and smell, but yeah, that's another
That's
point.
true.
Yes.
Good question. I think in my case, I haven't put much stock into the documentation of my works in the past. There's kind of so much that goes into just like the live presence and my focus on what happens in those spaces in the live, that I think that's sometimes both energetically and often also just economically in terms of scale or budget. This element of documentation has always troubled me. And let's say, again, in my mistrust of the dominance of the visual in our culture, I also have, it brings me into kind of crises to start thinking about, you know, how to represent or document the work. So what you saw today is an actual, maybe the first time it is actually the first time that I create a version of something that maybe gives an impression of the work. But it's of course like troubling to me that yeah, you cannot smell it. So I don't know if it's important. Honestly, like I've often been asked, you know, well, what about this practice of yours in 100 years, as though that would be a condition for like investing in creating culture or like working on the cultural level or something. And honestly, I'm sort of, I tend to kind of take it back to a human scale and sort of yeah, maybe it's not important in that sense of that to persist, or why should that be a condition or a value of the work? This idea of its persistence. So let's say it's an open question still for me, documentation. Although I wouldn't say it's ephemeral. I will just say that I don't believe that social bonds and that lived experience, I would not call them ephemeral. To me, these are very concrete and have very lasting effects. Social bonds can be more concrete and persist longer than most material we humans have created.
That's a very beautiful thought. I think that, well, sometimes it's just difficult when you are embedded in making. And I remember when I organized this World Gathering of Nomadic Peoples, that it was like for 15 days, bringing 300 people from around the world. At the end, I ended up like, I think 3 years older, but also like with 2 pictures. And then there's not much left apart from a lot of letters with the stamps, no, that they were sending me later from different places and so on. So yes, like what is the document, how to document, and what you do with the document later. So we're a little bit looking at processing the experience in other forms, like the radio station you saw before, and also working on the idea of archive and taking the archive as a matter of for a work in itself. No? But yes, I would say it's it's always like staying at a side. No? So it's not my specialty, I would say.
Well, thank you very much for your answers and for your presentations. And I will give back the floor to Marine.
All right, and we're back. Well, thank you again so much for this. And I don't know, Lucia, if you have a word of conclusion, maybe, because also what I wanted to mention, and Isabel, the concept that you also mentioned in your presentation that really interested me was the compost of the exhibition. This is absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is to me like a synthesis of all the art practice that should be rethought into the art institution and into the art world. I mean, the compost of the exhibition, this is a key concept to me in this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I also feel that it's the material waste that goes into exhibition making is very troubling, and something that I think there's so much that's possible with sharing of materials between institutions. I've always found it takes usually a little bit longer, a little bit more to coordinate. And sometimes it's actually not the cheapest. Sometimes the cheapest option is to just buy the new thing and throw it out in the end. But I think it's really relevant and important to say what materials are existing in the institution that can be put to use, what can be borrowed, what can be reused. And, you know, there's nothing about, you know, when you look at the Kunsthal exhibition, it doesn't have a kind of DIY-esque, let's say, aesthetic to it, but it's something that, but nonetheless, like the many of the materials are like, yeah, used, borrowed, reused, and will find their way to the compost and will continue to live with me as a kind of accompaniment of compost that you know, I'm now committing to.
Yeah, but I imagine, and my last question would be this one. I imagine that we can use this expression also about concepts and ideas and practices, right? Not only about materiality.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Like along with that, along with somehow that commitment to materiality, it helps to sort of frame also the ways that similarly, yeah, concepts also run their course, move through your body, are used and reused and rethought. So there is a way in which that compost space also holds a space for kind of reflection and reconsideration and a continual reconsideration. Even if we think we know what it is to be a human or what it means to inhabit a body, that needs to be rethought and reconsidered and reframed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Lucia, you have the final word if you want.
Just a word of gratitude. thank you for rooting us both in the place where we are now and for giving us a sense of what it's like to root within a body through a practice, within, you know, a series of landscapes through a practice, within a series of systems through a practice. I really think that we need to keep talking about this like ecological practice thing until it sort of makes sense, not to give it a name and kill it, but to
create a compost again.
Practice it, to really practice it. And so thank you, really, truly, just thank you. And let's do this again sometime.
Thanks to you. It was great.
Yes, and thanks for everything then.
Thanks
Yes,
for
thanks,
everything.
always.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much. It was a pleasure meeting you and having you tonight. And to all the French speakers, à demain pour la dernière session avec Art Review. Et voilà, et c'était un plaisir de vous avoir tous ce soir. Et donc pour les Français, cette idée de compost d'une exposition, comme on le disait, il y a un concept développé par Isabel qui peut s'appliquer aussi bien sur la matérialité que sur les idées et les concepts justement qu'on développe. Et je trouve que c'est une idée très forte qu'on pourrait aussi continuer à discuter tous ensemble. Voilà. Merci beaucoup et thank you again so much. And see you very soon, Lucia, of course.
See you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Bonsoir.
Bye.